All right, today we're going to dig into how the ancient world really thought about belief and disbelief. And spoiler alert, it's a perspective that might just surprise you because it completely reframes a very modern debate. So let's dive right in with a common accusation you've probably heard about the origins of Christianity, one that paints a pretty specific picture of its earliest followers. The idea is basically this. The first Christians were, a bit simple. That they were naive, less intelligent, and way more prone to superstition than their sophisticated Greco-Roman neighbors. And the folks who push this idea, they often point to a handful of Roman writers who were critical of the new faith. They use their words as proof that the intellectual elite of the day just saw Christians as simple-minded. But hold on a second. This brings up a huge, and I mean huge, question that almost nobody asks. If that's what they thought of Christians, what did these same sophisticated thinkers think about a complete absence of belief? Well, the answer is pretty stark. It's not even close. Far from admiring skepticism, the intellectual heavyweights of the ancient world almost universally saw atheism as a serious moral and social danger. And once you put that piece of the puzzle back, the whole picture starts to look very, very different. Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty. Let's see what the philosophical heavyweights actually had to say. We're going to take a quick tour through some of the most influential minds of the ancient world. First up, we've got the big one, Plato. And for him, atheism wasn't just some abstract philosophical idea. No, it was a direct threat to the stability of the entire state. He lays it all out in his famous work, The Laws. He basically argued that belief in divine oversight was the absolute bedrock of a stable and just society. In his mind, you take that away, and the whole thing starts to crumble. For Plato, it all boiled down to this. Without a sense of divine accountability, that feeling that someone is watching and that your actions have ultimate consequences, society itself just begins to fall apart. It leads to lawlessness and becomes a direct danger to the state. Okay, let's move on to his most famous student, Aristotle. He came at this from a completely different angle, a much more philosophical one. For Aristotle, atheism just didn't make sense. It was intellectually unsatisfying. He'd look at the incredible order and complexity of the natural world and conclude that a worldview without a divine cause simply couldn't explain it. It left the biggest questions totally unanswered. And then you have the Stoics. These guys were a huge deal in the Roman world, and let me tell you, they did not mince words about the social consequences of disbelief. The Stoics believed there was this universal divine reason. They called it the logos, that guided the entire universe. So for them, if you reject that divine order, morality loses its anchor. Your moral compass just starts spinning wildly because ethics become based on nothing more than whatever you feel like at the moment. Now, this is where it gets super interesting, especially how they saw another group, the Epicureans. See, the Epicureans technically believed in gods, but they thought the gods were just out there, totally uninvolved in our lives. The Stoics had a name for this. They called it practical atheism. Why? Because if the gods don't care what we do, the moral result is exactly the same: zero divine accountability. Let's talk about Cicero. Now, this guy wasn't just some philosopher in an ivory tower. He was a statesman, a politician, and he was worried about the practical day-to-day impact that disbelief would have on Roman life. Cicero's warning was really direct. He's saying, look, if people stop believing the gods are watching, the very foundation of our republic is at risk. Suddenly, the oaths you swear in court don't mean anything. Public trust evaporates, and the whole justice system, which runs on people telling the truth under oath, just starts to fall apart. And to cap it all off, we've got the historian Plutarch. He makes a truly shocking comparison that perfectly sums up just how deeply the ancient world feared atheism. I mean, just look at this. This is wild. Plutarch straight up argued that atheism was actually worse than superstition. His logic was pretty simple. A superstitious person might live in this irrational fear of the gods, but hey, at least that fear keeps their behavior in check. The atheist, on the other hand, has removed all the guardrails. For Plutarch, that meant all moral and social restraint was just gone. So you start to see a pattern here, right? When you zoom out and look at the whole picture, you don't find this ancient world that's celebrating skepticism. Instead, you find this incredibly consistent judgment across totally different and sometimes even competing schools of thought. This chart lays it out perfectly. It really didn't matter which school you belong to.
Whether you were a Platonist worried about social order, an Aristotelian trying to figure out the cosmos, or a Stoic concerned about public trust and virtue, the conclusion was always the same. Atheism was a serious problem.
Okay, so what? Why does any of this matter? For that original accusation we started with, the one about Christian gullibility, how does knowing all this change our perspective? Well, it totally reframes the whole thing. It shows us that the core ancient critique, whether it was aimed at Christians or atheists, wasn't really about being smart or dumb. It came from a worldview that saw divine accountability as an essential ingredient for being a good, trustworthy person. The main concern wasn't about being clever, it was about being reliable. And what's so fascinating is how this historical insight lines up perfectly with a central idea in Judeo-Christian thought. What you believe about ultimate reality is never just some academic exercise. It has real, tangible consequences for your character, your actions, and the kind of culture you end up building. And that leaves us with a final thought for our own time. The ancients were convinced that belief in divine accountability was the glue holding their world together. It really makes you remember, what are the core beliefs that hold our world together? And what happens when those beliefs begin to change?